Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 75th video in our Master Series and the 6th video in our Mixing Concepts. This video we want to dedicate to depth. Now, the first thing when we're talking about depth is that besides this concept that we had talked about, remembering to save a preset of the reverb and echo effect that we had created previous in processing to put on the whole mix so that the whole mix has its own, a set space that you're going to add more or less to each individual instrument or group of instruments, but that it has a set place dictated by the reverberation or convolution reverb you've chosen and the echo analog delay concept that we talked about. Besides that, we have delay as far as the instruments. This is a very simple concept. This concept is so simple that it is ridiculous, but it is very valid and can really help your production immensely. A very simple example of this is you've got the front vocalist here. Now, you may have doubled that vocal and put delay on one side, and you've got doubles of them. Now, if that's the case, you have to deal with the bus that's coming off. That is the place that we'd be wanting to put the delay that I'm talking about. Now, on the front vocal, you probably wouldn't want any, so no pre-delay on it or anything like that. It wouldn't be getting delay on that bus. Let's say you've doubled those vocals. Now you've got guitar and the bass over here. Now, on this bass and this guitar, that between this here and there's going to be a little bit of delay. It might be 1 millisecond. It might be the time it takes sound to get from this side of the head to this side of the head is at max about 0.65 milliseconds. So basically from here back to where that bass player or guitar player is going to be how long? I mean, there you've got probably 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4, 5, 6 milliseconds that there's going to be a delay back to them. Does that make sense? So on their bus, that you're going to want to put a delay on them. Normally when I'm doing the delays, I'll use these multiples like this. These are in fourths, and these are right here are in thirds. So I mean the first one, on this, if you've got 2 or 3 or 4 layers, that you'd be working from those layers. The first layer where that bass and guitar would be with 9.15 milliseconds. And then let's say you've got this back here that is like a keypad synth and sax player or something like that, and that's about where you want them. They would be like the second multiple here would be 18.3 milliseconds, and so on and so forth. Using multiples, I normally base the multiple off the Haas effect, meaning that under 36.6 milliseconds in my dial when I'm sitting in my studio, that much delay between one side and the other, if I got them fully panned all the way right, it still sounds like one hit. It doesn't sound like ba-bam. Does that make sense? And then I divided that into multiples, in fourths and thirds. We'll get into that in another video, more into that concept. But doing that all the way back into here. Now you might have some other instruments like something over here and something over here that you want to sound like they're back here, back behind the drum. So if you really want them to sound back behind the drum, you'd put a multiple of delay on that to where the drums would sound like it's hitting first. The amount of delay you're putting on there isn't audible. It's not like you hear the vocal go ah and then the bass player go da, so it's like da 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 back in the layers that you've put in delays on. It's not, it's underneath the Haas effect, or inside of the Haas effect, where it still sounds like it's one hit up to about 36 milliseconds or something like that, depending. They have some set numbers, but I've found that basically you'll be working with it until it, if you don't want to pass that barrier to where it sounds like it's 2 hits, bam. Does that make sense? And so it's a real simple concept, because the concept, beside adding on this front vocal, you've got that delay reverb preset we talked about, and you're going to put probably a little bit more on these ones behind it, and a little bit more on the ones back here, and a little bit more on the drums back here, and a little bit more on these instruments if you had some back here that you want to sound like they're back behind the drums and pretty quiet. Does that make sense? But it's kind of the same concept. It'll give depth to it. It'll sound like the a thing that you'll run into also is that anything that's delayed from something else, like if you hear the right over here and the left is delayed, but it's not sound like it's double hit, but bam, that it'll sound quieter than this over here. So you have to drop the volume of the one on the right hand side. But in this concept, you just want to put on the bus or on the single track itself, the last thing in line is that there's a delay between here and this lineup and this lineup and this line. Not much, because you know the time it takes sound to get from where the front vocalist is to the guitarist and the bass player stand behind him is probably at most, you know, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 4 to 6 seconds, milliseconds or something like that. You know, I mean, you just figure out from one side of your head to the other, it's like about 0.65 milliseconds to get from one side of the head to the other. So you figure it out yourself about how far they would be back. And add that much milliseconds on it, it adds depth to the mix. It's a huge concept because you rarely hear about somebody actually doing it, but it's present. When you go to see a band, not only are you a distance from them, but there is a slight delay between all of them. It helps build depth. It's part of the stereo field. You may not realize it, it may not be very much, but it is happening. It is happening, and it is, how do you say, it's contributing to that binaural, to that stereo field effect that you hear when you're listening to a band live. Does that make sense? And so, and on top of it, it actually sounds more realistic because that is realistic. Normally what is happening like that. Does that make sense? Or supposed to be. Anyway, does that make sense? Sometimes not. Some people may look at that different. So you'd have to evaluate that. For me, it adds depth and it adds more present. It adds more stereo field effect if you don't go overboard on it. I mean, you know, and it's like you don't want to go overboard on it. Between here and these drums back here isn't that long, isn't that far, bro. I mean, it's not that many milliseconds from front to back normally, unless you got a huge orchestra. If you got some, I don't know if I got one here of an orchestra, but if you got a huge orchestra, there might be a lot of milliseconds. I mean, it might be between the front, you know, cello player sitting up front or violin player to all the way in the back. There's quite a few milliseconds going to happen between there, but that adds huge stereo depth. So you basically want to talk about doing that. Remember when we talked about getting things in their place, is figure out between here and here, you know, how far, and then divide the multiples. Does that make sense? So you might have 1, 2, 3, 4 layers here. So if you got 4 layers here, you might only been using these 3. Because you've got the out front vocals, you have no delay on it. The second layer, you might have 12.2 milliseconds on it. The next one, 24.4 milliseconds. The next one, right up underneath the Haas effect. And you might want to scrunch those up also. Just remember when doing that, be real careful of causing phase effect. This normally happens between two like instruments or the same performance or something like that. But it can cause phase issues. But it's a reality that's happening in a live production anyway. So, I mean, when you reproduce that, it can add huge amounts of depth. So that when you start adding the reverberation effects and the echo effects that we talked about making a preset for, on top of that it can add huge amounts of depth to your production. So it's pretty simple. That's pretty basically the concept. And like most concepts, you really need to experiment with it. Get out a practice mix and sit down with it. Get the vocalist out front, put delay on the guitar, maybe the bass behind it. You know, you might have some keyboards back behind it or something going on, and the drum player back behind there. You know, and you can even put delay. I even will put delay on my drums. It's like, you know, between some of them, they're going to get delay. I've got my toms and my bass drum, and there's delay, maybe not much, but just, I mean, even sometimes a millisecond between you hearing the snare drum and the kick drum. I mean, there might be a millisecond there, you know, or a little bit less than a millisecond before you hear it. Every little bit helps to add depth. It does add depth. You experiment with the drums and A-B it off and on. Do one without it, do one with it, and experiment with it. You'd be surprised that it does add some depth, especially when you add the other reverberation and echo effects to that group or that instrument or whatever to help put it in its place and how far back it is in the stereo field when you're doing the stereo field work. So I certainly hope you will take that in consideration, really think about that concept and work on it, refine it, and get yourself a workflow going with it. Most of the time I keep the concept that simple in my head, and then I just start experimenting with each different mix. It can be a little bit different, and I just try to figure out what, you know, whatever the Haas effect is to where it sounds like, you know, it's 2 hits, da-da, anything under that to where it sounds like the same hit, and then I start dividing it into multiples. And depending, I might want to have it very little. I might only want very little depth to the mix, but I want a lot. I might want a lot, and there might be a 36 millisecond delay between this kick drum and the front vocalist. It won't sound like 2 hits, but it sure adds a lot of depth. Like it sounds like the kick drum, but it's like it's way back there, out of the way. Does that make sense? And then dividing multiples for each other group that might be in line, you know, that are in the line up to the front instrument or vocalist. So, peace, help, love. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I certainly hope that you take that mixing concept into consideration and begin trying to utilize it, experiment with it, and understand the benefits it can have to your mix. Peace, help, love. See you in the next video.